What's happening?
Hi, folks. I'm back. Sorry for the technical problems last night. If I were a better tech, I probably could have solved those in 5 minutes. But as it was, I'm not such a good tech. So last night, I ran out of time. But this morning, I unsnarled things. And so here we are. I learned a lesson in the process. So if the same thing happens again, I think I know how to solve the tech problem. So anyway, here we are. Tonight I want to talk about recent perspectives on COVID. But first I'll say hello. Hi, Dolores, and hi, Dia Swift. And Dia says, how are you and Bonnie Joseph, dear? We're doing fine, thank you. We had a very nice day today. And most of our days are very nice. Hello, Steve. I mean, maybe I work a little too hard for someone my age still. But we have really wonderful days. So Dia says, hi, Steve Wolfbrandt. And Dia says, so when are we getting our 1,400? I sure didn't make 50,000 a year. Dems had to just to submit to the Austerians. They just can't grow a spine. They haven't submitted to them yet. I don't know how much they're going to cut the limits from what was previously in place, because if they do that, it'll just be too obvious that they're breaking their promises to too many people. I'll go into that tonight in some of the pieces we take a look at. But Uh, anyway, I don't see the Democrats caving yet to the Republicans on the question of the limit. As more and more people are hammering home the idea that there's no political advantage in that, and there's no political disadvantage in actually doing what those Democrats who don't want to compromise want to do. So, Margot Shepard, how are you? How is Hawaii these days? And Kay says, hi, Joe and everybody. Thank you, Kay. Please share this as much as you can. I didn't get much chance to share because Facebook is slowing my sharing down. So what I need, I think, is for as many of you to do a few shares and hope those accumulate. And Lana is here from YouTube. Hi all. I'm going to share this video to Twitter. Please share this video. Thank you, Lana. Thanks for sharing it to Twitter. So I want to start today with the latest stats from Worldometer on COVID, or on the coronavirus to be precise, including COVID fatalities. At my last look, which was just a few moments ago, we in the United States had 3,572 fatalities today, according to the Worldometer site. And we have 27.4 million COVID cases, which is incredible. We have 1,417 deaths per million right now, which is really quite a number. Quite a number. That compares, there are other nations that are doing worse than ours, but nations of appreciable size. For example, Italy is sitting at 1,500 and the UK at 1,634. Remember when we were 12 or 13 fatalities per million behind the UK? I guess that was about a month and a half ago. Now they're 217 fatalities per million ahead of us. They have really been, doing poorly. They had 1,014 deaths today. You have to multiply that by 4.88 to come up with the U.S. equivalent. So what is that? Something like the equivalent of 4,888 deaths here. So they're still moving faster than we. Belgium is horrible. They have 1,830 fatalities per million, close to 200 more than the UK has. There are a number of middle-sized nations that are up there with the nations, I mentioned. Many nations have been suffering badly. Most of the world's nations have, I shouldn't say most, but let's put it this way. The top 76 nations on fatalities per million are over 307 fatalities per million. I think that's a lot of deaths. A lot of deaths. And I don't think any of those nations have performed well, and even nations in the range of 100 fatalities per million, I wouldn't call them good performers, because even that kind of death rate was not at all inevitable. And how do I know? I always go back to my old standbys. There was an article in Social Europe Today, which I won't go over, which pointed out that there seemed to be some kind of correlation between a lesser degree of fatalities and the poverty of a particular nation, where the well-off nations were suffering much higher losses than the poorer nations. And while that there does seem to be a correlation there, there are exceptions that show that nations that are well off economically can do very, very well. Now, there have been some deaths recently in Taiwan. Their total deaths now have gone up to 9 people, and that comes to 4/10 of 1 fatality per million. There are 24 million people there. Taiwan, of course, is not poor. It's a nation that has done exceedingly well economically. I know China would be unhappy for me to hear me call it a nation, because it's part of China and they have all kinds of justification for claiming that. But they nevertheless are an autonomous political system. There are 24 million people on that relatively small island, and they have only 4/10 of a fatality per million, and we can pretty well trust their statistics, I think, because they have a medical care system patterned after our Medicare system, except they extended it to everybody. And they have very low deductibles and low copays. And it's been a very successful system. They only developed it around 1993 or 1994. So they've gotten to its exalted state in a relatively short time, with a design based on our Medicare system. It's a very, very interesting case. But anyway, 4/10 per million is among the best in the world when we look at a nation whose statistics we can probably trust. When we look at a nation whose the statistics we don't have any reason to be biased against. Okay, now, another nation that's done very well, that is certainly a poorer nation than Taiwan, is Vietnam. They're also at 4/10 of a million, but probably most Americans would think that there was probably something wrong with the Vietnamese statistics. And maybe there is. I'm not an expert when it comes to their statistics. I don't have much of a feel for that. Anyway, looking at a nation whose statistical system would certainly trust, that is New Zealand. They have 5 fatalities per million. Now, they're a small nation, of course, but they are a very well-off nation. And they are a nation with very, very good science. They have managed the pandemic. by quarantining people when they needed to, by shutting down areas where they needed to shut down areas, by testing, by tracing, by rigorously replacing the virus. They've had these 5 deaths per million now for months and months and months. They just had 2 new cases, which is rare for them. They went for a few months without having any new cases. But they've remained steady at 5 deaths per million. Wouldn't we love to have 5 deaths per million? If we had 5 deaths per million, we'd have only 1,650 fatalities right now due to COVID. Instead, of course, we have, I didn't actually note what the total figure was today. I'll go back to that and give you the total fatalities figure for the United States, okay, in just a minute. I do want to point to Singapore. Singapore is a very, very well off nation as well. Of course, it's also small, but larger than New Zealand. We can trust their statistics too, I think, and they're at 5 fatalities per million. Marginally worse than New Zealand, but still at 5 fatalities per million. So we can trust that. We can probably also trust the statistics of South Korea. Let's find where South Korea is. Oh, I neglected to share this with you. They're at 28 deaths per million in a nation of 51 million people. We should be envious of their fatality rate as well. So, it was possible for advanced nations to do very well. It was possible for them to manage and contain the virus. But Japan has been having troubles lately. They have 126 million people living there. They've had more troubles lately. They had 115 fatalities today. But still, they're only at 49 fatalities per million. Not at, what was our figure today? 1,417 fatalities per million. We have to look at our management of the virus, and we have to accept that we have been terrible compared to what might have been. I've said this before, I'll say it again. We have been a miserable failure. Now, we can lay a large part of the blame for that on Donald Trump and his politicking and his lack of management of the virus. Oh, by the way, total fatalities in the United States, according to the Worldometer site, is now approaching 471,000. We went over 470,000 today. A terrible marker, of course. Before we turn around, over the next week and a half, we could be looking at 500,000 fatalities, and we know there's probably an underestimate of by another 150,000 to tack on that. So we are looking at at a terrible situation continuing to develop. Okay, I don't know what measures Joe Biden is going to take other than trying to get as many vaccine shots into people as quickly as possible to try to lead the United States out of the terrible place that it is in. He hasn't said but too much about that. But it's very obvious to me that if you want to contain these deaths, even more important than getting vaccine shots into people's arms is containing the virus through social management, through the kinds of techniques that were used in New Zealand, in Taiwan, in South Korea. We've never wanted to swallow that kind of strong medicine. But if we care about our fellow Americans, and if we care about people dying, that is what we need to do. While we're doing it, we need to provide the kind of economic support that will allow people to stay home. For a monetary sovereign like the United States, the money that would take is literally no object. Now, estimates are that if we were to do something like that, it might take 6 weeks to 2 months to contain the virus, to bring down the fatality rate to a very, very low figure. Of course, we cannot bring it down any lower than it is now because of the deaths we have now, but we can bring down the rate of growth. We're stuck at least 1,417 fatalities per million. The question is whether that figure doubles over the next few months or whether that figure slows to a halt. We need to bring it to a halt. We cannot have 600, 700, 800,000 Americans dying from this, people. We cannot. The federal government has to pony up the money. That 1.9 trillion is only the beginning. And of course, you couldn't pass a bill like this without getting rid of the filibuster. You have to get rid of the filibuster because the Republicans aren't going to go along. It's going to be tough enough to get Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin to go along, and other Democrats, to go along. But 6 weeks of money for everybody to get them to stay home if they need to stay home shouldn't be too heavy a lift. Of course, there has to be financial aid that continues to go on to bring the economy back into a full recovery. But the best way to make sure that the vaccine campaign is successful is to protect people while they're still waiting to get to the vaccine. That is the best way. And that is still something that we have to do. Now let's turn to an article that appeared in Presenza, the international press agency. It's called COVID-19 Pandemic Can't Be Managed. It has to be eradicated. It was done on January 28th, this article. It's called the eradication option, coronavirus, the eradication option. That's the option we've never followed here. This article is by Sonali Kolhatkar. Hope I pronounced her name correctly. It doesn't flow naturally to my lips, but I've covered a few articles by her before. She's a good writer. Let's look at this one. She says, the real answer to our dire situation is maddeningly obvious. Maddeningly obvious. She wants us to adopt a strong elimination strategy rather than trying to chaotically manage a disease that is overwhelming us. Now, I have to say, what I see from the Biden administration so far, and of course he's only been the president for a very short time, but I still see the administration as not going fast enough to implement a strong elimination strategy. I'm not sure that's the strategy yet. I think the strategy is to vaccinate as many people as we can, as quickly as we can. That's going to help. It's certainly going to help. It's going to end a lot of the fatalities, but to vaccinate enough people in order to bring immunity to all. So let's say they're vaccinating 1.5 million people per day. That's 45 million people per month. That's still 6 months. 6 months of people continuing to die. They'll die at a slower rate because more and more people will have the vaccines. The vaccines appear to be very successful. They appear to be able to prevent people from dying, even in instances where they don't actually stop people from getting the disease. So they appear to be very successful. But even if we could get most people vaccinated within 6 months, we're still going to have continuing fatalities. So where are we going to get to? Are we going to get to 20 fatalities per million? 30 fatalities per million before we're done? 30 fatalities per million is 1 million fatalities from a disease in the whole United States. Anyway, going on with Sonali's piece. For millions of Americans who believe COVID-19 is real dangerous, requires a plan of action, Joe Biden's election to the presidency has finally offered a path out of the seemingly never-ending pandemic. Indeed, compared to Donald Trump's approach, which centered on financing the development of vaccines but did little else to mitigate the spread of the virus or even to ensure proper distribution of vaccines, Biden's approach seems, in the words of one commentator, maddeningly obvious. Sorry, quote unquote. But in truth, it is not nearly enough. Naturally, we are optimistic. Biden has a plan and Trump didn't. But our optimism is a mirage. The new president does not aim to eliminate the virus. Rather, he wants to mitigate spread through expanding masking, testing, data, treatment, workforce, and clear public health standards. This is a fancy way of saying he plans to manage the pandemic so that infections and deaths don't overwhelm hospitals and ICUs all at once. He simply wants to spread out the pain. Is that the best we deserve? Or another question I'd ask, is that the best Biden can do? Is it the best the Democrats can do? I don't think it's the best we can do. True, there are vaccines being manufactured, distributed, and deployed as fast as possible via the patchwork and chaotic systems that were forced to develop under Trump's non-existent leadership. But already we're seeing new variants of the virus develop as it festers through cities across the world. Variants that are less responsive to vaccines, forcing vaccine producers to scramble to develop more effective booster shots. Even Biden himself admitted that Americans must prepare for hundreds of thousands of more deaths this year. Hundreds of thousands, 300,000 would mean we'd be at almost 800,000 deaths. That's not good enough, folks. We've already got 470,000 deaths. How many thousands more do you want to die from this? Meanwhile, Gavin Newsom appears to have simply given up, announcing to most people's shock that since deaths and infections in the state dropped slightly, it was time to lift some restrictions. So we got to stop the governors like Newsom, like Cuomo, like governors in all the states. Got to stop them from easing up on restrictions by giving the states enough support and the people in the states enough support that state tax revenue remains intact, so the state is not worried about lifting restrictions to get the economy going again, because its fiscal well-being is dependent on the economy going again. Get people the money they need to live at home. Get the essential workers the money they deserve for taking the greater risks, to allow people to still have the necessities of life. But going on with the article, the most populous state in a nation, which has also been the latest epicenter case of disease, may see some potential economic rewards, as per one report describing Newsom's decision. In other words, people may start to die again, but at least businesses may start to reap profits once more. Somehow we're supposed to take heart from that callous calculation. Between Biden's federal plan to mitigate the virus and state-level approaches that place profits over people, we're likely to remain stuck in this deadly pandemic, treading water for many months, unless the newly seated president takes drastic short-term measures. All he has to do is look to the east. Scientists have seen far greater success in ending the pandemic in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand, and Australia. Certainly, some island nations have a geographic advantage in being able to bar all air travel to help to eliminate the virus. But large nations like China, South Korea, and Vietnam have proven that one need not be a small island in order to successfully tackle the disease. These nations have the benefit of experience with earlier deadly diseases, and early on, they adopted an elimination strategy rather than a mitigation strategy. And that's the point. That's the point of the article. And Yaneer Bar-Yam, who's the founding president of the New England Complex Systems Institute, where he's an expert on pandemics and other complex systems, and works with initiatives like COVID Zero and the COVID Action Group, In an interview, he explained to me, there is no point in time where it's not worthwhile to get rid of this within a period of 5 to 6 weeks. So Bar-Yam thinks it would take 5 to 6 weeks to get rid of the virus. If we start now taking really strong action, much of the country would actually be cleared of the disease in about 4 weeks, and a lot of it, if not all of it, would be cleared by 6 weeks. 6 weeks. At that point, quote, we could start getting back to normal within a few more weeks, just being careful how we reopen, unquote. By strong action, Bar-Yam means a complete halt to all travel and a strict social distancing for a short 4 to 6 weeks. Well, this sounds horrifying to a population already weary of 10 long months of restrictions. It is a sensible way to squash the disease. Anyone who was infected with the disease at the beginning of the strict shutdown would not be infected at the end of the shutdown. Even accounting for the time that it takes for an infection to spread within one's household, by 4 to 6 weeks, intra-household transmission would be over with and none would remain infectious. Meanwhile, inter-household transmission would have been stopped via these strict measures. And that's it. That's why it would work. Coming out of the harsh shutdown, says Nicole Hadkar, we would emerge into a world largely free of the disease. Only at that point would a strategy of masking, testing, and contact tracing of the type that Biden is offering actually be effective at stopping small outbreaks. We would still need mass vaccinations, but the shots would be more likely to work if we stop the virus from spreading and thereby mutating. This is right. This is all right, folks. That's what we need to do. Bar-Yam explained that the longer we wait to take strong action, the harder it will be to take it and the worse the crisis will get. He painted a grim picture of the near future, saying that the new highly transmissible variants could overwhelm healthcare facilities by March 2021. An incredibly strict shutdown would be difficult to accomplish, but offer rewards so high that it would be worth the pain. And I have to say I agree with that. After all, millions of Americans have been stuck in a semi-shutdown for months with no end in sight. It's akin to a wounded patient opting for a painful surgery that has a guaranteed outcome of success rather than accepting endless Band-Aids to staunch the bleeding and prolong the pain indefinitely. Offering a tantalizing view of what Americans could enjoy if we followed an elimination strategy, Bar-Yam said the reopening wouldn't be the kind of haphazard approach we're using now, or an endless cycle of reopening and shutting down throws our society into chaos and puts normalcy ever out of reach. It would be a slow yet a methodical reopening, quote, which is what people are experiencing in Australia almost all the time, unquote. Right now, Bar-Yam said. When outbreaks do emerge, say from an international traveler, they're very small and quick, but localized action can squash them without disrupting society as a whole. That's what's happened in New Zealand. That's what happened in Taiwan. We do not have to accept Biden's prediction that 200,000 more Americans will die. If we adopt an elimination strategy, this would minimize infections and the terrifying long-term health effects of surviving COVID-19. And it minimizes the massive rising death toll that we seem to have become numb to. The New York Times assessed the state of Wuhan, China, a year after the pandemic was first declared. The city that became synonymous with death and suffering, offering a grim preview of the disease to the rest of the world, is now largely back to normal, except at the Times, in noting that today's Wuhan, quote, heralds a post-pandemic world where the relief at unmasked faces, joyous get-togethers, and daily commutes conceals the emotional aftershocks, unquote. Made no mention of the starkly different approaches that China and the United States have taken against the novel coronavirus. We Americans are unlikely to return to the pre-pandemic normal that Chinese residents now enjoy, simply because we're not trying to eliminate the virus like China did. And of course, she's right to point to China too. I know we don't trust their statistics, but if they were having a bad time like almost everybody else, you can be sure word would have leaked out some way, and our press people would be publicizing it like crazy. If they had a fraction of the deaths per million that we have, rather than something like 9 fatalities per million, if they had 100 fatalities per billion, we'd be hearing about it here. We're not hearing about it because they don't. They're only a little less successful than, say, New Zealand and Taiwan. I think they have 9 fatalities per million right now. They're near the bottom too. They've taken care of it because their approach was different. Their approach was different. It was an elimination-based type of approach. That is what they did. And it was marvelously successful compared to our own. Now I want to share one that appeared in Truthout. We did not, quote, lose loved ones in normal life to COVID. They were stolen. But Bonnie and I have been very fortunate. We don't know anyone in our family.
Or the development where we live.
Right. We don't even know anyone here in the 2 buildings where we live, full of seniors, who has died from COVID. People here have been disciplined. They have been afraid. They're not quite as disciplined as we would like all the time, but they have been more careful than most, and they are alive. It's not like the nursing homes here. It's a senior development. We have people here in their 90s. It's for 55, okay, and up. Have a lot of people, okay, in their 80s. We are not dying. We have isolated. Don't go out much. And we continue to live. And it serves really as an example for what the rest of the country could do if they stayed home for that 6 weeks that Bar Yam was talking about. Anyway, the piece I'm sharing now is by William Rivers Pitt. It was written on February 1st, and it's called Despair and Disparity, the Uneven Burdens. Oh, I'm sorry. It's actually, I read the title already. It is, we did not, quote, lose loved ones in normal life to COVID. They were stolen. And this is part of the series, Despair and Disparity, the Uneven Burdens of COVID-19. Pitt says, there's a great deal of talk about loss as we slog into the newest months of this long COVID winter. The lost lives, more than 441,000 people in the U.S. alone, are top of mind. He's a little behind, of course. He was even on February 1st, when we were probably about 450,000 then. The loss of livelihoods as businesses crumble under the weight of the pandemic, the loss of food and home security, a new truth for so many, as hunger and eviction stalk millions of people everywhere. Yet, loss, quote unquote, itself is a passive word. It's what happens to your lap when you stand up. Poof, it's gone. The fact of the matter is, those lives, livelihoods, and bare sense of security at the table and in the home were not, quote, lost, unquote. They were stolen from us over a deliberate run of months that saw the previous administration ignore, obfuscate, and outright lie about the quiet massacre that continues to devour the nation. That was beautifully put, wasn't it? By now, the world does not watch Fox News knows that very early on, Donald Trump was aware of the dangers of this pandemic, but refused to act because it might make him look weak. Moves to curb the spread of the virus, such as evoking the Defense Production Act, were not deployed because they were deemed ideologically unsound. How can government be an agent of positive good if, quote, government is the problem, unquote, according to Ronald Reagan. There is no squaring this circle. They allow base capitalist motives to drive the bus for no other reason than to avoid making capitalism look bad. Quote, but the vaccines, unquote, Trump's defenders will bray. Quote, we got them done so fast. We did that. That happened because of us, unquote. The push to see these vaccines into existence is commendable, and the fact that the science and medical communities actually pulled it off is nothing short of astonishing. This is not to be denied. Yet that's the one thing Trump and his people actively did to curtail this thing. Everything else, all the other necessities, like testing, contact tracing, masks, and fundamentally responsible leadership by example, all were left to rot by the roadside for purely personal and political reasons. When the Biden administration came into the White House, they discovered that Operation Warp Speed, the plan to get the vaccines massively distributed, was little more than a few wisps of smoke. Shipments of vaccine are spoiling because there was no network to distribute them. The elderly are made to wait in day-long lines to receive the shots. Communities of color are finding themselves far at the back of the line. Across the country, the Trump-Fed hope that the vaccine would save us and his re-election hopes crashed headlong into the reality that we can't get the vaccine because Trump's people failed to organize the process. Can you plug that in, Bonnie?
I'm trying to get
Or just stop it, please?
I'm trying.
That, but that, amazingly enough, is not even the worst part. Quote, top Trump officials actively lobbied Congress to deny state governments any extra funding for the COVID-19 vaccine rollout last fall, unquote, reports the Scientific News Journal, STAT. Quote again, despite frantic warnings from state officials that they didn't have the money they needed to ramp up a massive vaccination operation, without the extra money, states spent last October and November rationing the small pot of federal dollars they had been given. And when vaccines began shipping in December, states seemed to be woefully underprepared, unquote. Reaction from those affected by this wrecking ball nonsense was swift. On December 4th, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials and the Association of Immunization Managers sent a harsh letter to Surgeon General Jerome Adams. Recent communications by senior administration officials to Congress indicate that this administration and some members of Congress do not support our request for substantial additional resources for vaccine administration and infrastructure. We believe that is neither a partisan nor a political statement to share the very obvious fact that the vaccination of 330 million Americans safely and effectively will take far more than the 340 million currently allocated to local, state, and territorial governmental public health agencies, unquote. Not only did they ignore and disdain the threat of COVID-19, not only did they comprehensively fail to prepare for the necessities of vaccine distribution, they actively lobbied to strip funding from states that were trying to get things organized. We need to stop talking about loss, quote unquote, when it comes to the Trump administration's handling of COVID-19. Sitting at a bar, dining at a restaurant, going to a concert, taking our kids to the park, crowding around the family table for a holiday meal. All the mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, wives, husbands, and friends who were gone forever, they were not, quote, lost, unquote. They were stolen. Never forget that, and never forgive it. And say that to every damned Republican in Congress who voted against the impeachment, who supported Trump no matter what he did, and who still support him and who cower in fear of him every day. All of those slugs need to be thrown out of Congress as far as we can possibly throw them. And that fate would be much too kind for them. We often talk about the murderers by spreadsheet sitting in a health insurance company. How about the murderers by neglect sitting in the United States Congress? And the worst neglector of all, the man who knew better early in February and who lied to us, the contemptible inhabitant of that Florida community, Mar-a-Lago. Let's fix it so that he can never hold office again. Because these things were not lost. They were stolen from us. And he was the thief. Moving on. The so-called Moderna vaccine is a publicly funded miracle says Alex Lawson, the current executive director of Social Security Works. Alex says, the Moderna vaccine is a miracle of science. It is nearly, and by the way, Moderna is in quotes there. It is nearly 100% effective at preventing serious illness and death. By vaccinating the world, we can end the COVID-19 pandemic and save millions of lives. The only problem, we don't have nearly enough doses, but there's a solution. If the Biden administration allowed the generic manufacturers, not simply Moderna, to manufacture the vaccine at scale, the United States would no longer suffer from a vaccine shortage. This step is entirely appropriate because the Moderna vaccine wasn't developed by Moderna. The research and development of the vaccine were paid for by our U.S. taxpayer dollars. Of course, I don't agree that taxpayer dollars paid for anything. You all know that story by now. I'm not going to go through it again. But those dollars are owned by the United States and all its people and all the voters and all the taxpayers, even though taxpayer dollars did not pay for it. It was the dollars of a monetary sovereign that paid for it to the tune of $2.5 billion. In fact, Dolly Parton put more money into the vaccine than the company it is named after when she donated $1 million to the effort. This isn't Moderna's vaccine. It is the people's vaccine, and it's time for the law to reflect that. Currently, Moderna has a government-granted monopoly on the vaccine. That means they're the only company allowed to manufacture it. The only reason there's a shortage of vaccine is that we allow this one company to create that shortage. It is a nonsensical and corrupt situation. And by the way, folks, just to add to the article, make no mistake about it, it is endangering the public health. If by this time we had three times more of the vaccine available, as might have been the case if as soon as it was authorized, it was immediately spread out to generic manufacturers, we could be doing 4.5 million vaccinations a day, not 1.5 million vaccinations a day. So the delay is endangering the health of all of us, and not just us in this country, because we owe an obligation to our fellow humans and the rest of the world to get as much of this vaccine manufactured as we possibly can and get it out there so there's no shortage of vaccines in the whole world. Go on with Alex. That needs to change immediately. There's no need for the Biden administration to grant a generic licensing on every vaccine, although legally they certainly could. Pfizer and any other vaccines like Johnson & Johnson that ultimately get approved by the FDA can keep their monopolies. But we need a public option, and that's the so-called Moderna vaccine that we funded with our public dollars. They were public dollars. That's correct. They just weren't taxpayer dollars. Just vaccinating everyone in the United States isn't good enough. Vaccinating the entire world is both a moral imperative and necessary to end the pandemic. There's no other way to produce vaccines at the scale we need. Biden administration officials say that they're actively exploring, quote unquote, using the Defense Production Act to license the vaccine to generic manufacturers. That is encouraging. But with the new and more contagious COVID-19 variants quickly gaining steam, time is of the essence. We could face another global shutdown from a new vaccine-resistant strain of the virus unless we successfully arrest the pandemic with an effective vaccine today. The government should never have granted Moderna a monopoly over a vaccine. The best time to license the people's vaccine to generic manufacturers was months ago. The second best time is right now. Does anybody disagree with Alex here? Is there anybody in the world who would disagree with him about that? Next. There's the issue of limiting eligibility on the economic relief checks for COVID. This keeps coming up day after day, even though it's like stupid politics as well as stupid economics. Here's David Dayen's column from February 4th. First 100. The Wong case for limiting eligibility on relief checks is wrong. Yeah. It is morally wrong. Here's a nurse, an essential worker, giving someone an injection. Hopefully that's a vaccination. This Vermont nurse and others like her, making just above the median income, won't get a full relief check under a new Democratic proposal. You don't think that nurse does not need the full relief check? I'll bet you money she and her family do.
She put her life on the line.
In 2009, President Obama allowed members of Congress to write, and she's doing that every day, to write and direct the Affordable Care Act negotiations for way too long. Joe Biden isn't making that mistake. He's fully engaged in the process, encouraging Democrats to get the bill done quickly, and that engagement has coincided with this new development on the $1,400 direct payments, where Biden has held firm on the dollar figure but expressed openness to changing the eligibility requirements, which would start phasing out at $50,000 for individuals and $100,000 for couples. So in my view, you have to place responsibility for that emergence squarely on the president. This is his bill. If he wanted to shut down talk of any changes, he would have. Let's just say that Biden has a far different conception of how this would be perceived than reality. Quote, I'm not going to start my administration by breaking a promise to the American people, unquote. He reportedly said on a call with House Democrats yesterday, referring to support to keep the checks at $1,400. But changing the targeting most certainly would break that promise. Some would say conceiving of the checks as, quote, topping up, unquote, to $2,000 after a $600 check in December is already breaking the promise. I would say that. Given what he said in Georgia and what the other Democrats said in Georgia, nothing changed between December and today for the millions of people who would suddenly become ineligible for support. They'll just get sacrificed. And the question about that is why? Who is this for? Mark Goldwein of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the austerity crowd, estimates that the more tightly targeted checks would cost $420 billion as opposed to $465 billion. That's what we're fighting over. $45 billion in a $1.9 trillion package to deny middle-class people almost definitionally speaking, they make just over the median income. Relief. That's the holdup. Question mark. That's the holdup. The answer to the why is largely predicated on a study from Raj Chetty and his group, Opportunity Insights, which attempts to turn an obviously political imposition to allow moderate Democrats to say they had a role in scaling back the bill into an evidence-based one. This study is playing an outsized role in the debate all the way up to the White House. There are several major problems with using Chetty's data to make the case for more stinginess on the direct payments, however. The Opportunity Insights analysis looked at how families used the most recent $600 direct payment in January. They found that households with incomes under $46,000 saw their spending increase by 7.9% in the 2 weeks after receiving the checks, while those with $78,000 had spending increase only 0.2%. They estimate that those higher income households would spend almost none of the $1,400 checks, and therefore that money should be better targeted. The first problem is that deeper in the data, the spending effect holds up for households up to $59,000. Yet any single households over $50,000 in the proposed targeting would get less money, despite the data showing that they needed enough to use it immediately in the first couple of weeks after receiving it. The second and much bigger problem is that the data really only tells you that there's dire need below $59,000. The reason is that these households would spend quickly relative to higher income ones, is that they are running a severe deficit and need that money to fill immediate needs. Just because slightly higher income households aren't spending as quickly doesn't mean the money won't be used. And I gave the example yesterday, of course, that we had recently gotten my $600 check, and we haven't used any of that $600 check yet. We haven't spent any of it because we had enough in the bank. But we do need that check. We are going to have to spend it sometime in the future. We are going to have to spend it. I don't know when we'll spend that $600, but at some point in the future, I can guarantee we're going to spend it, and it's going to help perk up the economy, because we'll spend it only on the necessities, things in the real economy. Remember that the checks in the study came in at the beginning of the month. By the end of the month, those higher income households might need that money to pay bills or buy durable goods, or maybe they drew down savings to cover for lost income during the pandemic, and now they're building it back up. Would that be a waste, quote unquote, to allow people to accumulate emergency funds? Would it be a waste to allow families to pay down debt? The fact that these households don't spend the very moment they receive a check says nothing about whether or not it's good policy. Absolutely correct. Finally, there's the inconvenient fact that the eligibility thresholds will be based until there's more tax information on 2019 data. How can they base COVID relief on 2019 data? The fact is, that's a mistake. It's a plain measurement mistake. 2019 data for most people, especially people who are directly victimized by COVID, 2019 data is no indication of that. Because people particularly victimized by COVID will have been victimized in 2020. The first direct payment a year ago was based on obviously outdated financial information, and it didn't account for the extreme unemployment spike. But to base payments now, a year later, Oh, by the way, it is going to be a year later because it looks like, according to Nancy Pelosi, who is patting herself on the back all over the place because she's going to do a quick job of getting the reconciliation bill through and hopes to develop it long before the March 31st deadline. What did she mean a March 31st deadline? There might be a March 31st deadline for unemployment help for people, but for people relying on those stimulus checks, those checks should have been out yesterday. Yesterday. There should have been a checks and shots strategy. The bonehead Biden administration blew it. Didn't get the checks out on time, and Nancy Pelosi was happy to allow it because what the hell? She's got 2 refrigerators stocked full of designer ice cream. $20,000 refrigerators or freezers or whatever the hell they are. And because she's got more than $130 million in the bank or wherever she keeps it. Yes, you can still get the payments through your tax return, but that puts the onus on the individual to do a bunch of paperwork and await processing to get something they're fully eligible to get. As I said repeatedly, my ideal means test would be none. But if you must, give everyone a check and then claw back the money for undeserving quote-unquote households in the 2021 tax year, then you would actually be, quote, targeting, unquote, correctly and giving everyone a 15-month interest-free loan besides, which is the least you can do for people being jerked around like this by the congressional idiots who don't understand the immediate needs of many of the American people because they don't have any immediate needs. The concept of using the Chetty analysis to apply a means test that will rob someone of relief who made $75,000 in 2019 but has been unemployed since the pandemic makes a mockery of being, quote, data-driven, unquote. Incidentally, a significant number of people fall into that description, and up to 20% of them experienced food insecurity in the past year, and Dave has a link to a study on that. So there's no economic case for this narrowing, and politically, it's suicidal. You're taking the most popular part of the American Rescue Plan and chipping away at it for no good reason, and delaying that part of the plan also until, let's say, the middle of March it gets passed. Those checks are not going to get out even until April. And people were promised them in Georgia, they were promised them within a few days of electing Ossoff and Warnock. Now, of course, that was an irresponsible promise because Biden wasn't even going to be in the presidency until January 20th. So that was an irresponsible promise, certainly. But he did promise 2,000. He did promise it in a matter of days. The candidates promised it in a matter of days. They won. They have given the Democrats control of the Senate. Those checks should have been out by January 31st at the latest. At the latest. The Democrats should have ridden roughshod over the Republicans and the other Democrats about that. Biden should have threatened Sinema and threatened Manchin, telling them if they intended to be part of the Congress after 2024, then they had better go along with this, or Biden was going to have them primaried and support their primary opponent. He should have made no bones about that. Dave says, try explaining to the millions who will end up with less why this was done. Why White House economists sided with the Chamber of Commerce and the president decided to break a campaign promise while attracting no Republican support for his plan in the name of technocratic targeting, quote unquote. You're just cutting the benefit and doing it for reasons of politics. It's nonsensical. Why is it nonsensical? Because there are bad reasons of politics anyway. Biden is not going to gain any advantage from doing it. It's total stupidity is what it is. Total stupidity, as Dave and I have been saying for days. And he links to a Bloomberg article, by the way, which points to a divided White House. At least two of the president's two economic advisors, Heather Bushey and David Beckman, have privately expressed reservations about the size of the checks and at what level they would begin to phase out for higher income people, according to three people familiar with internal discussions. What's that about? Okay, what that is about is Larry Summers. There are people who still listen, to Larry Summers. Larry Summers people are still in the administration. Heather Bushey sits on the Council of Economic Advisors. Beckman is a deputy director of the National Economics Council. Neither of them would respond to requests for comment. Jared Bernstein, who's another member of the Council of Economic Advisors, and who was just in the presidential press conference today, said Monday that, quote, our oars are in the water, rowing in exactly the same direction when asked in an NBC interview about differences of the opinion in the White House. Anyway, there are people inside of the administration who want to target, who want to be wonky, who want to go work for the Center for American Progress or something after they get out. I mean, maybe Bushey already worked for the Center for American Progress. I don't actually remember. She did work for a Washington think tank. It may have been the API. She was supposed to be more radical than this. But anyway, that's it. There are people inside of the White House that are saying not so fast, who want to take a few dollars away from the American people and who want to deliver the checks sometime after. But people really need them. So one more, folks, before I consider your stuff. That's a short one. It won't take very long. It's from Ryan Cooper, who had a shorty at The Week, I believe also on February 4th. Yep. Is President Biden going to break his promise about $2,000 checks? During the campaign for the Georgia Senate runoffs, he promised if they won, they'd send out $2,000 pandemic relief checks. Well, they did win, and now Democrats are considering whether to break their promise. The previous rounds of checks, $1,200 in last March's CARES Act, and another $600 in December, began phasing out for single people. Okay, by the way, I've made the point to you that the $1,200 for the $600 is $1,800, and that's over 10 months. That's only $180 a month on the average that was given to people in direct payments. Peanuts. Even giving people $2,000 now would only come to a total of $3,800, and that's only $380 a month. By the time that would get to them, it would be less than that. It would be over 12 months. So what is that, $350 a month? I can't do that arithmetic in my head for some reason. Not thinking quickly enough today. Anyway, who made over $75,000 in 2019 or married couples who made $150,000, but Democrats are reportedly discussing slashing those levels to $50,000 and $75,000 respectively. There has already been some debate about whether Democrats really meant 2,000, including the 600 that went out in December, or 2,000 in addition. Ryan says, personally, I say they should do 2,600 in total, no matter what, because they might as well. Okay, and as Dave pointed out, we're talking about, how much did he say it was? $45 billion in a $1.9 trillion bill? Or was it $26 billion? I forget now. It was minuscule, though. However, there can be no question that slashing the eligibility threshold would mean flagrantly breaking Biden's promise. A threshold that low is cutting deep into the meat of the middle class and would cut the number of people receiving the full checks by about 14 percentage points, or about 45 million people. Moreover, leaving 45 million people out in the cold on these checks, on these $1,400 checks. Moreover, this choice of targeting is in fact hideously inaccurate. Tax returns from 2019 are now 2 years old. Incomes are volatile even when there's not a pandemic that causes millions of people to lose their jobs. Census data show nearly half of people who earn between $50,000 and $75,000 in 2019 have lost income during 2020. And of those, about a fifth have experienced food insecurity. On the other hand, people whose income has jumped since 2019, like if they graduated from school and took high-paying jobs, will still get the full amount, because in 2019, they were in school, right? They were poor, but they'll still get the full amount, even though they may have high incomes now. President Biden and the Democratic Party should keep their promise, says Ryan, and just send out the checks according to the previous formula. It's good policy and good politics. Absolutely, Ryan. Absolutely. So, in the face of the mismanagement of COVID and the extreme COVID failure, now they want to mismanage the economic relief too. And they are mismanaging it. They're doing something of rank stupidity, both from the economic point of view and from the political point of view, to make a certain group of people and the creatives who support them, the creatives like Heather Boushey, feel better, feel that, they're so fiscally responsible, because they don't want to admit that the United States is a monetary sovereign. They don't want to admit that. So now I'm going to go back to your comments and go through them as best I can. Where did I leave this? With Steve sharing it in 907. Dia Swift says, Reverend Barb, Warren Biden, quote, quit it with the unity crap, unquote, in so many words. But Reverend Barber is not amused. I'm not amused either. It's a scandal. Margot Shepard says, shared. Thank you, Margot. Dia says, antibiotic cocktail said to be very effective against COVID. I'll try to dig up the link. But thank you, Dia. And Dia says that Belgium has no sun. Yeah, Belgium is also the capital, okay, of the Union, okay, the European Union, okay, is in Brussels. And there are people constantly traveling to Brussels, okay, from all over Europe. Okay, and Belgium is one of the jumping off points, okay, to the UK, okay, as well. In other words, Belgium is a very important international center, and it gets a lot of travelers, and it never had isolation or quarantining or shutdown. That's another reason why it's getting. That may be more important than Belgium has no sun. Because the Belgians certainly know by now that they can take all kinds of vitamin D3 to compensate for the sun. Okay, and Dia says Germany had to send help to Portugal. Kay says no Super Bowl parties, people. Laugh out loud. I hate football anyway. Have the Super Bowl parties by Zoom. Invite people to a Zoom Super Bowl party. And then everybody can watch the Super Bowl while they all do striptease. How about that?
What have you been drinking?
Bonnie says, what have you been drinking? Leah says, I'm still hoping for the day Trump and his COVID super spreader states are tried for genocide. One can still dream. Evelia says, I read a Tampa clinic nurse was selected to launch the Super Bowl. Can you believe it? What message does that send? Dia says, meaning COVID spreader governors. And Dia says, but Vietnam still whoops all. And Kay says, damned sad. Evelina says, then again, that is part of the reason it's now called Florida. Shake my head. And Dia Swift says, Brazil is working on an antiviral mouth rinse to fight COVID. Great idea. I use peroxide. Anthony smiles. Dia says, briefly read a headline that stated COVID won't be manageable for 7 more years. Especially not interested. The U.S. Not sure that makes a grammatical sense. And Dia ends with, that is full of lunatics. Dia says the only way to halt COVID is to halt corporate greed. Well, we better find another way to halt it because we ain't getting rid of corporate greed anytime soon. I can tell you that. Evelina says, yep. It's maddeningly obvious it is the solution. Steve says, Sonali is a good journalist from Pacifica Radio. She is, I know. And Dia says, Biden is deploying the military to help vaccinate the masses. Dia says, new variants of vaccine resistant, okay, from what I've read, in varying degrees. The vaccines are probably still pretty good for the worst of them, which is the South African variant. And it was shown that even in people who have the South African variant, that if they got the vaccine, I think in their case, it was the Kaiser vaccine, there would be no fatalities from COVID and no severe disease, at least in the testing. So even though it's vaccine resistant, okay, to some degree, the vaccines would still help people, and be effective. But I still think, of course, that this should be an isolation-led strategy, shutting down the possible sources of spread for 6 weeks. Steve says hospitalizations are dropping here in LA County. The deaths remain high. Yeah, that's because deaths are a lagging indicator. Hospitalizations come first. Deaths come later. People die in the hospitals if they can get to one. Steve Gunson says trending Hashtag COVID Kim. Governor Kim Reynolds of Iowa takes off all restrictions. I'm guessing she has a super spreader bowl party to go to. Kay says, Steve, I haven't been following you here in Ohio much as it's too depressing. I do think it's getting a little better. And Dia says, state aid is most important. But even with federal state aid, corporations still want astronomical profits, and that's the problem. Well, guess what? They don't have to have those astronomical profits if the president has the integrity and the courage to take it away from them. Steve Wolfbrand says, a lot of people I work with have had it. Usually the whole family gets it. One death so far. And Kay says, USA stands for United States of Austerity. Shake my head, they never learn. Extremely depressing, Kay. Oh, they learn all right. They just don't want to admit it. By now, I'm sure, all the major ones know that the MMTers are right, that Stephanie Kelton, okay, is most likely right, that her book is most likely the book, okay, they ought to follow. I'm telling you, Krugman and Summers, they know that. They just don't want to vacate their places at the top, okay, of their profession, okay, and make room for Stephanie and for Randy Ray, okay, and for Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosler and the other great MMT economists, those who are coming along and who are great themselves, like Pavlina Chernyeva and Scott Fulweiler and Fadl Kaboub. Evelina says, not good enough to manage the virus to avoid overwhelming the health system. Surely the virus can be eradicated were there political will. But by the way, Newsom and Cuomo are two schmucks. Yes, Evelina, they are two schmucks.
Thank you.
Steve Gonzo says, on the bright side, Lou Dobbs got canceled. Oh, that is on the bright side.
I think he only got canceled for one day.
Oh, so Bonnie said she thinks he only got canceled for one day. Kay says, I agree, Evelina. And Kay says, what an ass Dobbs is. And Dia says, Biden should be sending folk vouchers or whatever for preventative vitamin D3. He should. And Dia says, did Biden even start that program that they used during the war to produce the needed the PPEs, etc.? I don't know to what extent he started it. He invoked the act and has said that he will start it shortly, but what he's done concretely at this point, I don't know. Dia says, the media should start showing the gruesome images of coffins and the suffering of COVID so people will get a grip. But of course, the corporations won't let them. Yeah, the mass media, the mainstream media won't let them. They don't want those things to be shown. Steve Wolfbrand said, who is he? Who is he? Probably, I don't know, what was I talking about at that time? I was probably doing Alex Lawson then. I remember when Dobbs had a show on CNN years ago. Well, maybe it was William Rivers Pitt, Steve. I remember when Dobbs had a show on CNN years ago, I think. Then he went to Faux News. Bad when you get bounced from there. He's probably going to Newsmax now. I mean, that's the next stop on the way down. Dia says, the China welded the door shut of quarantine violators. True story. Evelina says, so glad to hear Dr. Joe. Kay says, Steve Wolfbrand, he calls himself an economist. But the Bloomberg article estimated 7-year coronavirus recovery based on the current rate, okay, of vaccinations. No, if the current rate, okay, is 1.5 million per day, then that should be 45 million a month. So it's not going to take 7 years. It's going to take probably more like, I don't know, 10 months. Okay, because remember, some of these vaccines, in fact, the early ones, are 2-dose vaccines. Over 10 months of distributing 450 million doses, that may be enough. Evelina says, if that is true, it will overlap with the next pandemic. It might well, of course, the next one could be an extension of this one, because it could be a variant of COVID, which is actually mutated beyond the capability of the vaccines to protect against them. Thea says, keeping your shoes outside and sanitizing them prevents COVID. COVID spreads via shoes. China found that out too. Okay, Dia says, wear your hair covered and up because it too spreads COVID. Oh, gee. So Bonnie and I should always be wearing hats. Huh? Kay says, we will be living with this mess the rest of my life. I'm 67, maybe forever. Evelina says, Dr. Joe, do you have any COVID stats on Canada? Yeah, I didn't think to mention Canada. I don't think Canada is performing very well, according to me, in terms of my standards. But they are doing far better than the United States. Let me get to them. They now have lost total deaths in Canada, 20,609. Total cases, 797,756. The new cases as of yesterday were 4,022. They had 96 new deaths. Actually today. These figures aren't for yesterday, but for today. And their fatality rate is 543 per million. So far better than the United States. Okay, it's somewhat over a third of United States fatality rate. But it's not a good fatality rate. They're 53rd in the world. Many nations have done better than they. I don't know if we can trust the statistics there, but the Russian statistics are 519 per million. There are many places doing better than they. Many places. For example, Denmark is 379 per million. So Canada is not doing well, I would say. And, here are the Canadian statistics from Steve Gonzo. Thea Swift said, Trump is out of office now. Prosecute the bastard for the intentional COVID at their election. I think he should be prosecuted for that. It seems to me he should be personally sued for that. Now, there might be a liability clause somewhere, okay, in the law for presidents. Well, I suppose for presidents who make mistakes, who make decisions that are just bad, there's probably no recourse. But maybe for someone who was actually guilty of intentional neglect, maybe someone like that would be liable.
Right.
Such a suit has to be tried.
Right.
Yeah.
Post office? Right. Right.
Yeah, Louis DeJoy should certainly be prosecutable. Evelina says, thanks, Steve. That's awful. Kay says, how's it down there, Evelina? Laugh out loud. Not funded by taxes, but the Moderna research belongs to the people anyway, like you say, Dr. Joe. Steve Whitbread said, I think the Johnson & Johnson vaccine will do the heavy lifting. Oh, one shot only. Johnson & Johnson vaccine may actually turn into a two-shot vaccine. They're experimenting to see if the level of efficacy can be achieved by taking a second shot of the vaccine. Now, it would be a good deal later, maybe 6 weeks later, or 8 weeks later, or something like that. Kay says, how is it down there, Evelina? Evelina says, getting Sputnik shipments once a week, enough to cover all health workers. By March, everyone over 60 will be covered. Kay says, it must not be as widespread there. Kay says, I love Alex. Well, okay, I like Alex. I like his spirit. I'd like some really outstanding things that he's done. And I love the way he fights for Social Security. But he's another one who knows better, who by now knows enough to know what the MMT view of Social Security is. And he goes on lying about taxpayer dollars because he doesn't want to give up that trope and tell the truth for political reasons. And none of that has stopped the Republicans from attacking Social Security. You can say all you want that everybody has earned their Social Security because they've paid into it, but the Republicans are still going to cut it. They're going to use cost of living indexes that are invalid cost of living indexes, stretch out the so-called Social Security Trust Fund as much as they can over the years, and do whatever they can to deny current Social Security recipients, a living Social Security check, a Social Security check we can live on in dignity, as Roosevelt intended. And Evelina says, K. Clark Ryan, Sputnik 5, is it Sputnik 5 or Sputnik 5, is making vaccines like crazy. Kay says, is that the one from Russia? Steve Gonza says, the old public dollar trick. Quote, 1 out of 2. Evelyn says, people are just as undisciplined, but the government is moving with vaccinations. They expect to eradicate COVID before winter. Yeah, well, how many people in Argentina? 43 million, Evelina? Evelina says, summer here or summer in the U.S. Steve Gonza says, the more likely to be a school wave. Yes, Argentina is talking with them to make the vaccine in Argentina. Yeah, I'm getting them to license it to a manufacturer Argentina. Yeah, probably Russia will do it just for good relations in Latin America. I bet Putin will do it. Steve Wolfman said our government's inability to handle this is very eye-opening and scary. Look, I really think that there's no getting around the fact that when you constantly elect people who are very rich to Congress and who are very rich to run for president, and you elect one of those very rich people to the presidency, that they will always lose touch with the needs, of everyday people, with the needs and the struggles, of everyday people. I think it's simply a human nature thing. They're not living in our world anymore. They don't go shopping themselves. They don't mix with us. They don't mix with the hoi polloi. They don't hear people complaining from day to day about their hitting this financial squeeze or that financial squeeze. So they can't feel the urgency of them doing things in a crisis like this. They can't feel the urgency we feel because they're not subject to that urgency day to day themselves. I don't understand how Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are not screaming every single day about why aren't these checks out? Because the people need these checks. Every day they should be haranguing the Congress with floor speeches, naming names, being really aggressive about it. The people out there need this $2,000 check. They need $2,000 a month. And the people we elected don't feel any urgency. That's why we need people who are closer to it, who can feel the urgency, like the squad members. Like the squad members, they do feel the urgency. They're in closer touch with their constituents. That's the truth. We need a lot more of them all across the country. They should be the new Congress people. The Congress we elect on the next time, they should all be squad members. Steve Gonzo said, Kay said, I was wondering how well that one works. I'm not sure what one. Anyway, Steve Gonzo says the NFL offered JB stadiums as COVID sites. Yes, they did. Even it says, yep, or lack of political will. Maddeningly obvious. Diaz says, austerity is nothing but creating scarcity to force the middle class to go to work during COVID. Yep. Kay says, United States of austerity. But it's so needless. It's so needless. They could interrupt the process for 6 lousy weeks, and then everybody could go back to work. Everybody could go back to work. After that, if we took it back to the beginning, with no cases in the country at all, or close to no cases, then the contact tracing, testing, quarantining, isolation strategy would work. We'd be like New Zealand then, except far bigger. Evelina says 92%. Kay says that's good. Steve says, anyone heard anything about Israel having a cure? Okay, I saw a blurb about it. Oh, by the way, I hope they have a cure because they just passed Canada in fatalities per million. In other words, the fatalities in Israel are a little higher than the fatalities per million in Canada. So, nope, Steve, where did you hear that? And Steve says Facebook. Facebook, yeah. The high efficacy is a bit deceptive. Maintain protocol. Yes, we should. Evelina says 100% would be high efficacy, laugh out loud. Well, reportedly, the vaccines do provide 100% against severe COVID and fatal COVID. So that's good. Kay says, means testing for my food stamps is coming up for me Tuesday morning. Shake my head. Steve says the promise was immediately. It was, Steve. It was immediately. And we get a piece from Yahoo News. Israeli COVID drug cured 30. Well, that's interesting. I'll grab that link later when I can grab links again. Dia says, Biden's dogs are living better than we are. Dia says, Biden is a half-stepper too. Yeah, I know. It looks like a half-stepper. Steve Gonzo says, Israel, the flag of Israel is seeing a sharp rise in the number of children and teens getting COVID-19. Greater than 50,000 children and teens have been diagnosed with the virus since the start of the month, which is many more than Israel saw in any month during the first or second waves. They're unlikely to open school. Kay says, but Summers needs to go home and STFU. Steve Gonzo says he ought to go to Nancy Pelosi's place and eat ice cream with Nancy Pelosi. Steve Gonzo says 30 people study. And Dia says, Schatz put Larry Summers in check today, though. It was wonderful. Please supply the link. And goodbye. Larry got dragged on the twit to today, says Steve Gonzo. And Evelyn says, Steve Gonzo, where did you read that? Dia Swift said, politicians want to keep us so desperate, so we'll keep being their willing slaves for donors. Steve Gonzo, where did you read that? Laugh out loud. And Steve gives a link to Twitter, which I cannot click in my interface, but I will certainly look at later. Thank you for that, Steve. Steve says, I'm sorry. That is, Stephen Wolfbrand says, I'm sorry, but 1,400 is definitely not 2,000. I agree. It's definitely not 2,000. Sadly, Summers has been all over the news today, but so has Bernstein, who has disagreed with him but big time. Yeah, Jared does disagree. He's much more over to the MMT side. He is. He's been getting closer and closer over the years to MMT. Dia Swift says, the middle class help the poor more than the rich. So that too is something the establishment wants to kneecap. Evelina says, Steve Gonzo, source please. Dia says, it's not the mismanagement, it's class sabotage. Sandy Degg says, knowing Biden, he probably forgot what he was supposed to say about the amount of the checks. He wanted the press to submit their questions before his conferences with them. They said no. The last two conferences, he did not take questions. He makes his speech and zooms out of the room. Yeah, He does. And Dia says, important point about Belgium. Thank you, Joseph the Wiser. I don't want to know about that. But Kay says, I use peroxide too, laugh out loud. Kay says, I hear of awful side effects from Pfizer. Well, actually, I haven't heard about that. There was one guy here who drove to Washington to get his shots over at the VA. His daughter took him into Washington. Very nice daughter. Drove him into Washington. And just yesterday, he got his second shot. And he was a little tired when he got home yesterday. Okay, and then today we saw him in our lobby and got to talking with him for a minute or two. And we asked him if he had any side effects, okay, because it was the day after. He said, no, absolutely none. So that was one case where there was no side effect. Source is above your... Oh, I see. It was that tweet source. Source for Summers getting dragged is me, and I helped. He said the 2009 stim was too small. He now says the coronavirus stim is too much. Steve Wolfbrand says me too, K. Well, but Stephanie thinks that this stim should be at least $3 trillion. And Larry says that this stim is too much. So, who do you think is going to be proved right? Unfortunately, Stephanie might not get a chance to be proved right because Biden might listen to Larry too much. Well, probably what he'll do is continue to go with his 1.9 trillion that Larry thinks is too much. So at least we can take satisfaction in that that Larry is going to be wrong again. He's been wrong about everything over the last 10 years. At least he was probably wrong about things before that too. Evelina says Steve Gonzo underwent phase 3, which includes placebo payments as well, Evelina says. Ricky Rance says 7 months. Ricky Rance says 7 years. And Ricky Rance says tomato. And Steve Gonzo says Dominion may be going after every stop the steal types you can think of. Requested Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc. archive outlets, anchors, online personalities. Stacy says, have the biggest hair ever, and it's everywhere. So wearing your hair up probably isn't a thing to prevent COVID. Also, I wear my shoes in and out. And she says, basically, I'm Pharaoh. And Steve Gonzo says, even my hair freaks me out. I sometimes spray it down too. I go full hazmat. Oops. Steve Gonzo says, cute. But what do you mean inside out? Stacy says, in and out. Kay says, I need a hair trim badly. I keep it tied up to keep it out of my way. I need a hair trim badly too, but it hasn't gotten so long that I have to tie it up yet. Okay, but Bonnie is going to give me a haircut soon. And she says, no, she's not. Yes, you are. And Dia Swift said, but Trump's author proved Trump was liable. He should be liable for certain things. The key question is he civilly liable for things he did, as president of the United States? I suspect if criminal neglect can be shown, or actually it's criminal negligence, right? He might be liable that way. He says, I'm pretty sure I had COVID in December of 2019, and 3 months later, half of my hair fell out. It's white too. Has it gone white since December of 2019? Suddenly all went white? Steve Gonzo says, get home, strip down. Diaz says, Dobbs not expected to be back on the air, the LA Times wrote. He's finally going to retire and eat ice cream right. Stacy says, I'm almost always home, though I made a pilgrimage to H Mart and Wally World yesterday. What the hell is H Mart? I don't think we have that here. Had to buy Baldo some death soup, ramen. Don't know what that is. Dia Swift said, Jeff Merkley warns Democrats are sacrificing Georgia and will lose it due to Biden's reneging. Yeah, I mean, I think so too. I think so too. On the other hand, if the promise is kept, then I think Warnock is going to be reelected in 2022, if the promise is kept. I think Ossoff was elected to a full term, so he's safe for a while. But of course, there are congressional candidates who are going to run, in Georgia. And if the promise is not kept, it's going to hurt those candidates too. Steve Gonzo said, I've turned the ramen into an art form, laugh out loud. So what do you put in your ramen, Steve? Kay says, I just think those rich people don't give a damn. Even Bernie Cave with the 2,000 minus 600 equals 1,400 bullshit. Yeah, Bernie is caving to Biden on certain things, and that was one of the things that he caved to him on. Kay says, wish I could vote for Nina. Well, you might get a chance if she gets elected to the House quickly this time. Okay, and then she runs for the empty Senate seat that is going to be vacated by Portman. Then maybe you'll get to vote for her for the Senate, Kay. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Evelyn says, sure, a lot of people think they had COVID before tests were widely available. Kay says, Bernie is doing the best he can. I don't know if he's doing the best he can, but I'm sure he thinks he is doing the best he can. I don't think he operates, Kay, in any other way. But like all of us, he's not infallible in his judgments. For example, he certainly should have stayed in longer and extracted more from Biden in return for his support. Steve says it would already be all squad, etc., if it wasn't always at all levels rigged. Yes, I know, rigged by money. Rigged by money. Kay says, I think my daughter had it, but her doctor blamed it on her thyroid problems. Tests have been very unreliable. Steve Gonzo said, you can just call me Gonzo Joe. Yeah, but I like Steve. I'd rather just say Steve Gonzo and Steve Wolfbrand. Stacy says Summers is a misogynist pig. I know he is. That stuff about women in mathematics, what an ignorant bastard. And Dia Swift said, not having vaccine side effects may not necessarily be a good thing. Dia says, be a good thing, typo, sorry. And Stacy has been pretty white for a long time. I started going gray at 11. No. Kay says, my late hubby and I used to trim each other's hair. Haven't had a trim since he died in 2016. Steve Wolfbrand says 11? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Catherine Tokarska says, H-Mart is great for Asian goodies, in produce. Oh, so H-Mart is probably similar to the Lotta supermarkets here. That supermarket here is great for Asian goodies and produce. Yes. Evelina says, were you very blonde as a child? Stacy says, gray is a color too, so is white. Stacy says, no, I had what amounted to reddish golden brown, but my hair was all sorts of colors individually, black, gold, red, brown. Lana asks, does Bernie have the power to say 2K versus 1400? I don't know if he has the power to get that out of his committee. He may be able to get the 2K out of his committee, but if he puts in the 2K, that may disturb whether the reconciliation bill fits into the limits, okay, that were placed on it. Okay, I'm not saying it does, because it's not that much money, okay, as we just heard. But it still may disturb the balance somewhere. Stacy says, I'm a roan. What's a roan? Not sure I know what a roan is. Anyway, I think we may just have come into the end of things, or close to the end of things. So, Dia says, the GOP demanding militarized fencing be removed. Ha! They're hoping for another insurrection. Lana says, okay, thanks. Oh, by the way, it would be $45 billion difference. Whether that would disturb the balance enough to make it out of bounds if he added that, okay, I don't know. If I were him, I would certainly try to add it. I would try to add it because it is politically very important. And the people need it. They do need it. And it's politically really important. 45 million people getting cut out of $600 and maybe more. If they start to fool around with the limits, they should definitely not start fooling around, okay, with the limits. But also, the headline number is important. That's what people are going to remember. Stacy says, it's a dark-colored horse that fades as it gets older. Now, I thought that roans were red. And Steve Wolfbrand says, good night, all. Good night, Steve. Steve Gunza says, instant mashed potato rations out well, too. And Dolores Pierce says, thank you and good night, all. Kay says, thank you all for a great discussion again. Night, all, and love you all. And Lana says, ridiculous. That would be a tipping point. Yeah, $45 billion difference. Once people hear about that out of a $1.9 trillion bill, and they say, for $45 billion, you're not giving me my extra $600 stimulus? They're going to be so pissed. People are going to be so pissed. Anyway, thanks for coming. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for staying. Stacy says, roans can be read or done. And Dia says, will you be on for the impeachment? That would be cool. Good night, loves. When is the impeachment trial scheduled again? That would be February 9th it starts, right? Yeah, I think I'm going to be on for part of the impeachment. Don't know how much of it I'm going to cover. I want to see Jamie Raskin because he's going to do a job on Trump. A great job. Sandy says, thank you, good night, everyone, and thank you, Joe and Bonnie. Thank you for coming, Sandy. Great to see you. Lana Dell says, good night. Okay, thanks for tweeting this out, Lana. I'm going to end the broadcast now.